Writing from the soul is the mother of all invention, and 21 Grams is back for another season of this exploration. We will look into the artist and the art they create. Except, this season we're adding the questionnaire, invented by the great Bernard Pivot, to go even deeper. They say 21 grams is the weight of the soul, and this show is the scale. So now here's your host for 21 grams, Joe Compton. Hello everybody, welcome to another 21 grams. Super excited to have you here because I have the awesome Juliet Rose with me tonight, and I'm real excited to talk to her. I was just telling her off camera that I just started getting into Stitches, her latest release, and I'm just flabbergasted. You're very talented, my friend. You're very talented. So we'll get into it a little bit. But I always like to start the show with the opportunity to afford you the chance to tell everybody a little bit about yourself. So if you wouldn't mind, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, yeah, as you know, I'm Juliet Rose. I am an author. I'm originally from New York. I've lived all over the country and in Mexico, and I currently reside in the mountains of Georgia because I just couldn't deal with the cold anymore. So here I am.
Well, Georgia has its own kind of cold, doesn't it?
I mean, once you've lived here, maybe, but like if you've lived in New York, especially upstate New York,
yeah, okay.
Not really.
Well, upstate, yeah, upstate, I can totally see that, yeah. Yeah, like Buffalo. I don't think anybody would want to wish that on their enemy. So,
yeah, and I lived in Buffalo, so yeah, I totally,
yeah,
totally get that.
Pretty horrible. I mean, it's only horrible for 3 months out of the year, right? And then it's kind of beautiful. No? Okay.
Should
All right.
we'll
let sleeping dogs lie there. Anita's here. Hello, Anita. Nice to see you. This is a really good one, Anita. You're going to really enjoy this because Julia is one of it's very fascinating what I've discovered about your writing and just reading a little bit about you and then talking to you, obviously. But is horror kind of one of those first loves for you? Is that kind of something that you kind of gravitated toward at an early age?
You know, it's interesting because I think that didn't really get into horror till I was about like 12, 13. But I always liked stories that kind of had like the dark side. And like my favorite children's book when I was really young was Watership Down, which I'm not sure I should have been reading that at that age. But, I really like The Outsiders. I really like stories that tended to have like kind of that dark twist of like humanity or dark twist of things. And I think horror was kind of the natural progression from that.
What was the gateway drug? Was it King? Was King the gateway?
Unfortunately, I think for most people, yeah. I read Christine when I was like 12, and I also love old cars, like I still do. And so I think that was just like it loops me in.
Natural fit, yeah. I contend my favorite actually car horror is Shattered by Dean Koontz. That's one of my all-time favorite books. So I loved that book, and it kind of that Poe was my gateway. But I think a lot of the idea of psychologically messing with somebody is very interesting to me, and I'm getting the sense that it's very interesting to you as well. Is that kind of the twisting and turning and the aspect of really kind of scaring you with your mind something that you kind of like to explore, even in your other genres, which we'll get to? You kind of have kind of a mindset about psychological.
Yeah, I'm definitely a psychological writer, no matter what I write. So whether it's horror or it's contemporary fiction or what it is, that's the first thing I do when I write is to dive into the character's mind, and then I try to make the reader do the same thing.
Yeah, it's amazing. I personally really love the nice little app touch you have in Stitches with the quotes that you utilize, and how they kind of mark the territory of about what you're about to experience. And I think I always am fascinated, but like movies that used to do that and books that do that, where they kind of tell you everything you need to know right up front. even if you're not aware of it, but you will be, kind of thing. Was that kind of is that the first time you've done that? Is that something that you wanted to try and tackle and see if that would work for you?
It is because I think that every time I write a new book, I always want to take on something new. So,
Mm.
and I have to say, like when I was like a teenager, I literally would sit and read like Bartlett's quotations because I love quotations. Like to me, they sum up so much in so little. So I was pretty excited to be able to add that to this book. And every time I'd find like the perfect quote, I'd get so excited. I'd be like, yes, this is exactly what I'm trying to say. So yeah.
I would assume the story came first, though, and then you found the quote for it.
It did 'cause originally, I think I said to you, originally it was a short story, and I sent it
Mm.
to one of my best friends, and she said, "No, you've gotta write more. This is not a short story." And so, as I started to, like, fill it in, then the quotes came along with that.
Yeah. Is the darker tinge and your love of darkness, is does that creep into your other genre writing a little bit?
Yeah, I think that with even in my contemporary fiction, when I've had people read it and then they talk to me about it, they're like, "You definitely have, like, a darkness to this." And, I think that's just, I think, natural for me to always I wanna show light, but I wanna show the darkness because then you've got that balance.
That's awesome. I mean, you're what? How many books were 8 books in for you? 9 books at
The
this
novella
point?
is my ninth. Yeah.
Y- Is there something that inherent about the? Have you developed a style you feel is are you feel very comfortable with your voice at this point? Do you is that the easiest part for you in terms of developing a story?
Yeah, writing has always come so easy for me. It's never been something I've really like sat down and struggled with. And I didn't
Mm.
write for many years, but I was raising my children and I didn't really have the time to do that, with work and raising them. And so, that was definitely interesting because like I was able to table it. And then as soon as I pulled it off the table, it just started flowing out of me so much that I can't stop. Like now it's like I write every day. I'm always thinking of stories. If I was joking around with a friend and I just happened to say something to her and I said, "Ooh, that would make a good story." So my brain's just always keyed into that. So that part's really easy for me, the writing.
Yeah. So I mean, have you have you felt like there was a more comfortable genre for you, or do you feel like you still have more genres to explore because you've crossed a few right at this point? So
Yeah. Yeah. It's part of that challenging myself thing too. And I think when I came back to writing later in life, part of me was like, I want to try everything. Like I want to see if I can do it. So sometimes I'll say, I'm gonna write this just to see if I can. So I think that I'm comfortable kind of I love horror, but I'm quiet horror. So I my stuff tends to like even my contemporary isn't so different. Even though they're different genres, if you read them, you would know it's me writing
mm.
both those stories.
It was that kind of the thought process into jumping genre. Were you ever concerned about jumping genres? Because I know that's a common concern amongst authors, especially if they have a readership already or a base that they want to appease. That if they jumped, that maybe that readership wouldn't follow them. But it seems like readership follows the voice, not the genre, in my experience.
I think to a degree that's true. I think there's definitely like niche readers. They just want to read
Mm.
just horror. And so I've had people that have really liked my horror book, didn't necessarily want to read my other stuff, or vice versa. I mean, I have people come up to the table whenever I have my display and they're like, I hate horror. I love horror. So you definitely have people that don't, no matter what you write, they won't touch it if it's not what they read. But for the most part, people that have read my stuff have read all of my
Well, I certainly am going to be amongst them. So,
stuff.
but your gateway drug was horror for me. So I'm real excited to read the contemporary stuff. Tell everybody a little bit about the books you've written. Go through each one for us and kind of give us an overview of each of them.
Sure. So I'll start with when I came back to writing, I wrote Do Over. And that was one of these books that, I literally hadn't written in so long. And I laid in bed and I thought, how did I used to do this? So I was like, how did I used to write? And I laid there and I just started like drawing up imagery. And I drew up this image of like a woman sitting in a car looking out at the beach, but like you could tell she'd been chewing on the sides of her fingers. You could tell she had like anxiety from that. And that story really grew from there. And so what it became was a story about a woman with dissociation who would run every time she got into a situation that she didn't have to face. She ends
Mhm.
up in a town in North Carolina, small beach town, gets a job, kind of starting over. which she's really good at. But the difference this time is she starts to connect to people in the town. And she comes to find out there's like this underlying ketamine abuse in the youth of the town. And somebody she meets ends up dead. And so like through that, she initially runs, and then she realizes that she doesn't want to. And so that story really gets into, kind of that dissociation and mental illness, but also gets into like why we connect to people, why people use drugs, like why was this such a problem in this town? Like why were the youth really gravitating towards this? And so it really gets into that story as well. So that was the first one that I wrote. The second one that I wrote was We Don't Matter. And it's interesting because the main character in We Don't Matter was a very big character in Do Over. So I don't say it's a series and they're totally standalones. But when I wrote him in Do Over, he just wasn't done. And so 7 years later, this character resurfaces in We Don't Matter. And he's a film student in Seattle. And when he and his friends are out, he's filming stuff because he always does. And he happens to capture a really terrible event on film. And it puts him and his friends on the run because they're basically in danger for what 40 caught on film. It's also an LGBTQ story because he told me that's what he was when I was writing this character. He's like, this is who I am. So that's who he was. It also gets into church abuse and, kind of growing up gay in the church, and specifically certain types of churches. And so that's that story. Do you want me to go through all these really?
No, we can sprinkle it in. We'll go through a couple more in a little bit. You said something interesting though that sparked a conversation I want to have, and that's the idea of characters speaking to you. So they come to you and they tell you their story. Is that kind of how it works for you? Is you're driven by the character and what they want to tell you?
Very much so. Sometimes I'll even start like with an idea of a story, and I have these idea of the characters. And as soon as I start writing, they're like, that's not who we are. That's not how the story's going to go. And so you have to just really listen and you have to let it flow out. So I talked about this at Multiverse. I'm not an outliner because I would end up throwing away the outline pretty quickly. I'm really like a pantser. Like I kind of go in with an idea, but let's see what happens. And it always makes a better story for me anyway.
You just made every outliner who will ever watch this cringe by saying, "You're gonna throw out my outline."
Oh yeah, I when I was in school, my teacher would always she's like, "Where's your outline?" I'm like, "I don't use an outline. I can't," because for me, if I use the outline, I really am only cobbling myself in my creativity. So everybody has to do what works for them. To me, that is just something that actually prevents my creativity.
I often find though that there's kind of a middle ground for everybody a little bit. I mean, there's some really starch outliners I know that will never stray from that aspect of it, and they really are disciplined and they do their thing. But even them I'll get them to admit finally that there's a little bit of the character talking to them and takes them on a different way than they thought. But do you find that because now you're 9 books in, that you have a structure though that you kind of follow, or is it different from book to book for you?
I definitely have. I don't know if it's like really a structure, but it's how things happen for me. And one thing is, so much stuff works itself out in my head before I ever sit down and start to write things on paper. And I send myself notes all the time. Like I'll just send notes through Facebook. And if anybody else read it, they wouldn't know what it meant because they might be like, ducks in the water, and they'd be like, what does that mean? But I know what it means, so it works. So like there's a whole process that before I ever sit down to actually write, I've worked through so many ideas that I've scrapped, where I'm like, I think I'm gonna do this, and like, nah, that's not gonna work. And so like these conversations with the characters happen long before I ever sit down and actually start writing.
Do you question them? Do you is that how you kind of discover who they are a little bit? Do you kind of pester them and kind of figure out certain details about them, or is it more that the story is just there and you go through details as you're trying to write the story?
Yes. No, I'm both. Yeah. So I think there's a point where I kind of go through, that initial character development where you kind of think about why would this person be in this place? What kind of brought them there? But then as you're writing, sometimes that story changes. Like you find out that's not why they're in the place that they are. It's completely something different. I rarely know the end of a story when I start to write. I think I might know it. Like I'll be like, I think I know where this is going. But honestly, it's just like when I sit down to write a chapter, I'm not going into that chapter with this is what's going to happen in this chapter. I'm more like going in like, let's see what happens in this chapter, So it constantly evolves, and I just try to go with the flow on that because that's where I write well.
When did the other character from Do Over start talking to you about, hey, you're not doing me justice?
Well, it's interesting. In Do Over, he was literally going to be in one scene because he's the brother of the person that she knows that passes away. And so he's going to be just in the funeral scene. And there was just something once I started writing him that he had so much more depth. And then so I said, okay, I'll put him in a few more scenes later in the book, so this will weave into the story. And really by that point, he had grown to me so likable. Like I really ended up loving this character. And to this day, hands down, he's one of my favorite characters as he went into We Don't Matter. He was funny and he was snarky and he was like whatever, like, and I really just felt like this character had a lot more to say to the world. So
I'm curious, which book do you feel like is more of you than any other?
I often mention We Don't Matter because that's a lot of, I think, this different aspects of ourselves. So it's the aspect of myself that really cares about the world I live in and refuses to kind of just sit and take things. And so this has it gets, I don't say political because people misunderstand that, but it gets social, it gets into the world we live in. And so that was really important to me to have that voice. But the more recent book, In Dreams We Fly, which is a time travel, the little girl is very much who I was. I lost my mother at a young age. I had to go live with family. I just felt very isolated and like I didn't really belong. And so I used a lot of myself as a child as that character. So I really connect to that one as well.
That's awesome. I'm curious your thoughts on, women in horror is starting to get buzz again, and it's starting to, and rightfully so. It shouldn't even be a discussion. It shouldn't be a topic that we even have a discussion about. But it just seems like there is more. There was more female Bram Stoker winners this year than there's ever been. Shout out to my friend Cynthia Palau, who became the first Latina X to ever win a Bram Stoker. But it's interesting to me that I think women have such a great perspective on horror, really, to be honest. And I think it's very cool to watch the world starting to gravitate toward that. How do you feel being a woman in horror right now?
Yeah, it definitely comes with its challenges, and I'm not going to deny that. When I was first writing and thinking even about my name and what I was going to put out there, there's so many women that still use initials because they don't want to be immediately discriminated against in horror, and that sucks. I'm just going to say it like it does, and I didn't want to do that. I'm like, I am who I am. This is what I write, and I read as much as I write. I read way more, and I read a lot of horror, and I can say women in horror just come with a different perspective, and they can get just as dark and just as brutal and just as twisted as anybody else. There are books that I read from a woman, and I just have to put it down and be like, wow, that's intense. So it definitely is a frustration. I have at times felt like maybe if I didn't have a female name, that my books might be more receptive to people that didn't know me if I presented in that more of initial way, but I refuse to do it. You're going to have to like me for who I am. If you don't, you're lost.
Yeah, totally. I love that. I love it. Yeah, I'm curious how many people came up to your table. I mean, maybe not at Multiverse, because Multiverse is a little bit more diverse and a little bit more understanding. But I'm sure you've had experiences at tables where somebody come up to you and goes, "Where's the romance?" or something to that effect.
Yeah. And luckily, because I am cross genre, I can always point them to something. But I do get that thing where I say, because I'll always introduce my books and say, I'm cross genre. I read everything from contemporary fiction to horror, and I separate my books that way. So I'll be like, over here is this, over here is this, and you'll just see them kind of look at me, look at the horror, and just go the other way. But I mean, I do get a lot of people who are buying my horror novel is probably my best-selling novel that I have. Just really close with We Don't Matter. Those two kind of run neck and neck against each other. And I get a lot of really good feedback. If I'm not splatter and I'm not, extreme. So it's not going to appeal to somebody like that. I'm quiet horror. So I'm going to tell the story. I'm going to weave it. I'm going to make you creeped out. But, it's not going to be immediately slasher type stuff. But I get really good feedback. on the style of writing that I do. From ironically, a lot of men like the style that I write.
Well, I'm glad I could fit into that group then, I guess. But yeah, Amelia says most of the horror writers I know are women. Yeah, me too. I mean, most of the ones I know. I mean, I know a lot of horror writers, but I don't know them. So a lot of the people I actually have befriended and talked to are women in horror. I find that the interesting thing about the psychological element is I don't think it's the one thing that I know I've written from a woman's perspective before, and I felt like I did it so badly, and I think where women have a distinct advantage in terms of horror writing is in the psychological elements of things, because you deal with so much psychologically in the real world, and you see things, so much more astutely than men do. And I'll say it, I'm dumb when it comes to that stuff. So, like if you changed your hair color, I probably wouldn't have noticed 4 times already. It would probably take me 5 months to figure out that somebody changed something about themselves. But it's interesting to me because I think a lot of women try to go the gore route in a lot of things too, and it just I don't know, I'm fascinated by that aspect of it. So psychological seems to be more of the wheelhouse. And I'm do you feel like, have you felt like you wanted to try the gore or kind of do a different type of horror just to try it? Or I mean, because you're one of those people who like to challenge themselves, right? So but is that one of the challenges that you've kind of presented for yourself?
Not with gore, only because to me, I mean, even like watching horror movies, I tend to gravitate towards ones that are more supernatural or psychological. I'm not a huge gore person. I don't enjoy it to watch. Like as soon as I'm watching something, I like it if they get into like a torture scene or they get into body horror. I don't want to see it. I don't. And there are some amazing female authors that write gore impeccably. Yeah, I mean, they're great. So I think for me, I just haven't challenged myself to it because I just don't enjoy it. So it's hard to write something if you don't enjoy it personally.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, that's why a lot of men don't write romance, right?
They're just not good at it. No, I'm just kidding.
Exactly. Yeah. Like I said, we're dumb. What are you going to do? But it's just fascinating to me because I really think the way you write is very reminiscent of a Poe in a lot of respects, and there's just an interesting element to, like, I could see a jump scare coming, right? But the way that you present things is kind of very almost vague enough to like get me off the wrong path a little bit, right? And so I really appreciate like that because it makes me feel smart when I read something like that and understand it, right? But so for you when you're writing it, I'm kind of curious the adventure you go on yourself, and do you second guess something so that it might be too easy to figure out, or do you kind of just let it be whatever it's going to be? How do you approach, when you get to a point when you're going to twist and turn?
Yeah, so I never go into anything with an intentional twist. Like I'm like, ooh, I'm gonna build in this twist. If a twist happens, it happens because it was meant to happen kind of in the flow of the story. But I do often, like when I'm writing, I want to make sure I'm feeling scared. If I'm writing a scene and I want the reader to feel scared, I want to make sure that I'm kind of looking over my shoulder in my house too, because I'm like, I want to make sure I'm a little creeped out. And I mean, when I wrote Through the Surface, which is the novel, there was a point where I actually had to stop writing one evening because my husband got into bed. It was just me in the house. It was dark and I was freaking myself out. So I was like, okay, that's good. I did good, but I have to go to bed now because I don't want to do this at night in the dark. So, so that's really my goal is, I also think I think twists naturally come because I don't always know what's going to happen. So times I'll be writing and all of a sudden the twist will pop in my head. I'm like, ooh, that's good. Let me do that. But that's really just embracing like the story and letting it just come out the way it does.
I love that. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm curious, do you have a set write goal for yourself every day? Because you said you write every day, or is it just a matter of writing every day? Do you have a word count or anything like that?
Mine's really just a chapter. And say for some reason I have to skip a day, or, I'm
Mm,
not feeling well, like I was sick. So I really didn't write much in the last couple of weeks because I was sick after Multiverse. So then I'll try to sometimes catch up a little bit. So maybe like on the weekends, I'll write 2 chapters a day, or I'll get
mm.
to this point. But typically, if I can really set into that routine, I like a chapter a day. Like I have to finish something. I can't half write because then it bugs me all day. So I have to be like, I'm going to write a chapter. And so that's typically my goal, is to finish whatever I started that day.
So how do you handle when you scare yourself and you have to stop? Do you just stop, or do you kind of push through it a little bit?
I pushed through a little bit, but usually like that night I did stop. In the morning, I just got back up and finished. Like, because it was one of those things where it's like, okay, I'm really scaring myself. Like it's really spooking me out. And so I just got to a good place in that chapter and paused. And the first thing I did that next morning was make a cup of coffee and sit down and finish it,
Nice. I love that you went back to finish it. That's
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, I have to, otherwise it'll gnaw on my brain and gnaw on my brain until I do. So
You find though, because this happens to me a lot, right? And I'm very similar to you in that respect. I do feel like I feel like I have an end point. I see an end point and I want to stop, but then I start to really get into it and flow a little bit more. And so I don't want to lose that flow, and I'll go a little bit past that, and then I'll have gone too far sometimes.
yeah.
But sometimes I go really good for a long time, and so I don't let it die. I don't stop myself. Do you feel like that's kind of how you approach it as well, or do you have a discipline where you do, after where you wanted to stop?
Yeah, because I have a day job, a lot of times it's not up to me. Like I'm like, oh, it's time to, I got to go to work. So if
Yeah.
if it's the weekend, I've definitely had weekends where I started out to write a chapter and 12 hours later, I finished the book, type of thing.
Mm.
I've definitely had that, but I have to have the freedom of not having work. And most times work just tells me what I have to do. So
So you're a morning writer then?
I am. I try to be like, I've been writing a little more in the evenings these last couple weeks when I was sick, just because I felt like crap in the morning. So I would do that. It's not as natural. For me, the morning is just more natural for me to get up in the morning when I'm not thinking about anything else. I'm not thinking about work or, kind of caught up in the day. I can really sit down and just focus in on that.
Yeah, the day does knock the crap out of you sometimes, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely does.
Yeah, that's why I never understood like writing after work kind of idea, because that's the hardest time for me to be focused. I just want to kind of just,
Zone. I want to
yeah,
zone. I'm
yeah,
tired from work. I just want
take
to
a
have
breath. Yeah.
right dinner, watch my favorite program. But it's really hard for me to write in the evenings. Mornings, like I said, are just that time where like you almost want to. You wake up and you're like, let's
Yeah.
do this, and that I really enjoy that part.
The other thing I'm finding that's interesting about the way you write is it's not truly cinematic, but I could see where, like, in certain ways you stop in certain pages and have to make me turn to the next one, and that there is kind of a movie going on in your head a little bit. Do you
Yeah,
feel like that's kind of is that kind of how you feel like when you're writing it? Do you feel like you can see it
absolutely.
visually?
That's. I mean, when people say that they don't see that, it kind of blows my mind because when I'm writing, I'm in that scene. I'm really just transcribing what's happening in
Mhm.
that scene. So I'm looking, if say it's Dover and it's at the ocean, I'm looking out at the ocean with them. I'm hearing the seagulls. I see the characters interacting, and I'm just writing everything down furiously to capture all of that. Like I'm not creating it, I'm transcribing it.
How do you edit that then? What's your process for editing through that? Because if they're speaking to you and giving you the story, do you feel like do you ever rewrite, or
Mm.
do you feel like you just kind of
Yeah.
work on the grammar aspect and things of that nature?
If I rewrite, it's really minute amounts of rewriting. Like it might be just let me flip the sentence around, or let me kind of
Mhm.
I'll add in details. Like times I do the first draft, and so maybe I'll go and say, okay, I need to add a little more in here. Or I'll expand it. It's rare that I just completely delete something and start over.
Mm.
Because I think so much of it has worked itself out in my head prior. And then, like I said, because I'm literally watching this kind of movie play out, it I've already worked out a lot of those details. So it's rare for me to rewrite at all. I usually am grammar and like I said, just flow. I always say it's like flow. Does it flow? Does it sound right? Do I need to add a little more to make it flow? Do I need to flip these sentences this way to make it flow? But that's pretty much it.
I'm curious, as a novella writer, you've written quite a few novellas. Have you felt the urge to try two things? One, screenwriting, obviously. Has any of these stories ever felt like you wanted to try and do it as a screenplay? And then the other thing is, have you looked at Vela and putting something out via Vela, because you do kind of do like you do. Finding that there's a lot of episodicness in the way you write.
Yeah. So for the first question, yes, to me, they're all movies. And I think, like years ago, and I had a book that I wrote in my 30s and it's no longer in publication, but I was sitting in an event and, selling that book. And I had a guy walk up to me and he kind of picked up the book and he flipped through it and he asked me to describe the book to him. And I did. And he said, "You're really a screenwriter." He's like, and he kind of went through this whole explanation of the difference. And I was like, okay, dude, whatever, but like he ended up being some guy from the Screenwriters Association, but he's like, you should really consider looking into that. And I think, honestly, the reason I haven't was simply because I'd have to take classes. Like, I don't know how to do that, so, is one. And two, like, to me, it's easier sometimes to write the novel and think about it being adapted than to writing as a screenplay and trying to market that, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I wouldn't have written a screenplay too if I had run into that douchebag too. So look, the way it comes out is nobody's concerned about how it should be or what it should be. It's the way you feel about it, right? It's the way you want to write it. And so I just think that's so terrible that people would do that.
Yeah, and it threw me for a loop because I'd never heard that, and I was like, I didn't really understand kind of what he was saying. But like later, I was able to kind of see what he was saying, and
he just didn't convey it right.
He didn't convey it right, and like, yes, my things are always movies in my head, so like they're still movies when they're in the book, like they just are. Mm-hmm. I'm very much I love movies. It's the thing, like I really get into that. So like, it is a passion of mine, but for me to sit down and write this is what I know, and. Yeah. And as far as the second question, Vela, I haven't looked into it. I know some people use it, but I'm pretty unfamiliar with it altogether.
Yeah, it's like on again, off again. People are getting success, and then it's dying, and then people go, it's dead, and then they leave it, and then people come back to it. It's a typical Amazon bad thing.
Okay.
So you have you thought about adapting. Have you, is there a particular story that you think about quite a bit as adapting into kind of a movie idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think We Don't Matter is just, again, because it comes from so many things that I care about and that I'm frustrated about in the world. It gets into like protests and it gets into police brutality. It gets into things that like really have kept me up at night. And it's like one that I would love to see as a movie because I think it would speak to people with those aspects without it hopefully creating contention. Like hopefully it wouldn't create, I mean, I guess everything does, people to fight, but I think it has a really like good message, and I think it actually would have a really good market.
So you're out there selling your stuff. What is the biggest lesson you've learned about manning a table and selling your stuff out in public?
That I need to talk to people. I'm terrible at it. Not in these. I'm great on panels and I'm great in like podcasts because we're having a conversation. But to initiate conversation for me has always been so unnatural. So then like people walk up and I go through the initial freeze where I'm like, and they'll be, "Hey, I'm the author," and I had to actually work out a script in my head to do that, because when I was first doing, because I've done this for a couple of years now, when I was first doing it, I really would be like, they'd be like, "Are these your books?" And I'd be like, "Yeah." That'd be like the length of the conversation, So now like I try to explain a little bit. So like really interacting, because I think, the market's very saturated. There's a lot of books out there. There's a lot of really great books out there. And I saw that at Multiverse, just walking around the tables. I was pretty blown away just at the quality of indie books that are out there. Yeah. So you really have to connect with people and find out what they enjoy and really kind of get the right book into their hands. So that was a hard step for me. I mean, it took me a long time in practicing this little spiel, over and over again until I was comfortable enough to make it natural when I was talking to people.
I found you very natural, but of course we had just met like a month ago, so
I'm ultimately just an actress, Yeah. What you see is not what's going on inside of me. So
yeah, it is kind of a new art. It's an art form to kind of to put it mildly, to kind of put yourself out there and present yourself and present what you're doing, and do it in a way that's going to entice people to buy it, right? So I, I I'm wondering, because they're novellas, do you have an easier time than you think you would if they were all novels?
Well, most of my books are novels. Stitched Together was my first novella.
Oh, okay,
But I did find, because I've had that out now for a couple months and I've done a few events, price point just helps. People, especially when they're doing an event where they're buying so many books and they're like, oh, yeah,
sure.
I'll be like, these are this and this is this. And they'll be like, okay. And it's also, I think, a lot of people feel like a safe bet to start with an author that they don't know, is to find something smaller, something cheaper. So if they don't like it, they don't feel like they lost out,
Mm.
and a lot of times I do have people that will get the novella and then will buy something else after. It's like, oh, I like your style of writing. And so then they will. But I do think having a novella helps, because it helps people, when, like I said, if they feel like they can't commit. But also, for me, if I have younger people that come up, teenagers, I have something that they're more likely to gravitate to.
Have people been asking you about audiobooks?
Yeah. And, Through the Surface, I have as an audiobook.
Hmm.
But one thing I have to say about audiobooks, and it's one of those things that I've really thought about, is it really, like, and I love my narrator. He's somebody actually I knew, he's another writer, and I knew him and his voice. And so we worked out a deal. And, but that's the thing, is if people don't like the voice of the narrator, they will discard that audiobook. And I don't like I listened to what is the most recent, Fairy Tale by Stephen King, and I hated the narrator. I had to put it on like double speed to get through it because I couldn't stand the narrator, right? So that's the part of audiobooks that's a little frustrating, is it's the same story, but if someone doesn't like the narrator, they may not like the story then, even if they had with a different
I
narrator, if they just read it.
I got to imagine that he has right to refusal. I don't think Simon and Schuster can just go, "Hey, we're using this person." But he has picked some really terrible narrators.
Yeah. And his books are too long to listen to a bad narrator. So I feel
Right.
like this book is really long and I can't do this for 24 hours. So,
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. I had a real hard time when I put my first book in an audiobook. I had a real hard time with it. And it's not because the narrator is bad. My narrator was awesome as well. In fact, my narrator taught me a lot about narrating, and taught me a lot about how bad my first book was as well, because he had a lot of trouble reading some parts. But it's interesting because I felt like, because I come from a film background too, so, and collaborating is a natural process for me, and I kind of felt like this was more of an isolated process for him, and like, you gotta let me do my thing, kind of,
right.
where I felt like, I was kind of micromanaging a lot of it, and because I know exactly what you're talking about, where it's like narrating can be really, really terrible, and people will tune it out right away if they don't
Right.
like it.
Right. I've actually, like, on that, and I have people that love my narrator and I have people that hated my narrator. And I've had people that have given me bad reviews because of the narrator. Like, I love the story, but I hated the narrator. I'm like, I don't think you're reviewing the narrator, but okay. Yeah. So, and the problem is, like, I've never seen a book where everybody's like, yes, we all love that narrator. So
Yeah.
it's so subjective on the person's personal preference. So I've kind of shied away with it with the rest of the books, just until I can really figure out what I want to do. And I've even thought about narrating my own books, but I don't want to hear that much of my voice. I just don't, I just
And
don't have to
again,
listen. And again,
it's another, well, it's also another art form that, people don't realize is an art form. And that's, I mean, we're going to talk about this in the news that I'm doing tonight, the news show I'm doing tonight, about Amazon deciding that they're going to try out some AIs. And it's just like, I think, and people doing their own books is even worse than bad narrators sometimes, because they don't understand audio, and how there's hisses and
exactly.
pauses and inflections, and
Oh yeah.
and all of that takes some time. Yeah. Nita says, I felt so bad when I had to tell my narrator to redo stuff. She did a good job. Yeah, me too. I really had, I especially after we kind of had a little, me and him had a little sit down, and had to hash it out, because I was feeling like I wasn't being part of the process. And you know, you are reading my book, but I got what he was saying, and my now ex-wife kind of hit me in the face and said, "Just let him do his thing. What are you doing?
Yeah.
You're paying him. Let him do his thing. That's the part of it. I'm paying him, so that's
Right. Gotta have a say.
But yeah, I mean, I get what you're talking about, though. I mean, uh, is there one that you think you might try though down the road that you think might fit the audiobook version better?
I mean, I can't say there's one that I don't think would work. I think that, just again, I think it's finding the right narrator, but I felt like I found the right narrator. I thought he did a great job. Um, the criticisms again were, I think, somewhat opinion. Again, I think any of my books really work well in that kind of narration standpoint, just simply because I write them to be that way. There's a good amount of dialogue. I try to really balance dialogue, action, description in a really fluid way so that it should be easy. But and again, it's not cheap to find a good narrator and to get that done. It's not cheap. So if you do all of that and then you feel like it's not panning out for you, then you're like, should I have done this? Should I redo it? And so it's something I've just tabled for now while I think about, really how I'd approach it.
Nice. Are you working on something right now? Have you started something new?
Of course, right. All these are the time I'm not writing. So yeah, I'm currently writing a novel it's going to get into kind of like the cryptid folklore a little bit, but again, character driven. So the main character, this isn't a mystery or spoiler, but in the beginning of the book, he's living in the neighborhood in West Virginia or in Kentucky that he's always lived in. And he dates a girl that lives in the neighborhood, and they've dated for a few years, and he's walking her home one night, and he goes home, and later he gets a phone call from her mother, and she hasn't shown up, even though he walked her, pretty much he saw her get to her house. Ends up she has gotten murdered somehow between the time when he left her and then it fast forward to years later, and he's a raging alcoholic. He's he was initially blamed for it, so he's got like this guilt and stuff like that. And so like a lot of the story gets into like his alcoholism and then him trying to find his purpose in life and what he's doing. So he happens to start seeing something in the woods, and then I'll leave it at there. But it gets into like, but it also gets into like he has a neighbor. He ends up kind of caring for the neighbor's child through a tragedy that happens. And through this child, he goes kind of cryptid hunting. But through that, he's actually learning a lot more about humanity. And so I'll leave it at that. But it really is, I always, again, trying to twist into like, what do I want to do next? And I'm like, I really want to challenge the story. And I don't want a story that's just about like the Kentucky wild man, which is what initially he thinks it is. I wanted something that was like, I wanted to have the human factor. Like, why is this person doing the things they're doing? Why are they tormented? What is his torture that he's carrying with him? And really to resolve that through these stories.
Is it always a psychological element that sparks you, or is it something else? It just varies.
I mean, I think the psychological aspect's always there because, again, that's kind of how I think. But sometimes, like, I'll get triggered for an idea from a news article or a song or something like that. I'm like, oh, okay, that makes me think of the story. But immediately my brain goes into the psychological standpoint. Then from there, because then it's like, okay, I like this idea for the plot of the story. So say like with Prick of the Needle, which was the third book I put out, I saw an article about how they use prisoners for firefighting. And I really wanted to kind of get into that a little bit because, again, an area that I felt had a lot of stuff. But before long, the main character, she's getting out of prison. She was a firefighter when she was in prison, and now she's a supervisor. But she's still dealing with like her want for her heroin addiction. She's dealing with like her place in the world. So it gets into the psychological, but you're still going to be dealing with the firefighting and that type of stuff as well.
Tell you touched on Through the Surface. Tell everybody a little bit about that one, and tell everybody a little bit about Dream too, because the Dream that's the one I have. So I'm real excited.
So Through the Surface was my first. I always call it traditional horror. And I've always wanted to write something like that. So that really came from when I was a teenager. I would go up to, there's an island off the coast of Maine, and my step grandparents had a lodge. And I would go up there. They were really old, and we would help kind of just take care of it for the summer. So my brother and I would go and we'd weed, and we'd, kind of keep things up around there to help them out. And I mean, it was on an island of like 300 people off the coast of Maine. Very isolated. I slept in a cabin in the woods that had no electricity. So, like it was one of those like kind of experiences where
Built for a horror movie.
Always a little scared. Yeah, like I was always at this point of like kind of on edge, and I'd be walking around the island, and of course, I feel like people were watching me. And they had a little library, and of course, they were stacked with like Stephen King, and Dean Koontz, and so I read a lot of Stephen King and Dean Koontz while I'm on this island in Maine in this cabin in the woods, and so like that really kind of I took all of those like those fears and those things that I went through, and I built this story, which is Through the Surface, which takes place on an island on the coast of Maine in a lodge. So I really just took those experiences and turned it into a story.
That's awesome.
And then In Dreams We Fly was my first kind of dabble into sci-fi, really, and it's time travel. But I always say it's like light sci-fi because it's really just about this little girl who her mother dies and she moves down to Wilmington, North Carolina, to live with her aunt and her cousin. And there's some kind of things going on. Like I always have layers to the story. So some definitely stuff going on that she doesn't know, but she keeps like waking up in the cemetery. She keeps like, she finds like she's wedding. The bad things are going on. And so she just has this kind of like something else is going on. And then one day she likes to roller skate, and she goes roller skating, and she comes out, and her aunt's boyfriend's there. And she just knows immediately something's not right. And she runs. Of course of running, she sees somebody dump a body in the woods, and she goes further into the woods and gets lost. It turns into a time travel story. She ends up at a cabin. There's things about the cabin. She finds a latch in the floor. She ends up getting transported to 1929. She's also a biracial child. This is the South. So a lot of kind of different storylines come into what happens when she goes to 1929 and then comes back. And so that one, and like I said, for me, that one was a lot of taking my childhood, things I experienced. My mother died when I was 11. I moved in with other family, kind of always felt shuttled around. I did live in Wilmington, North Carolina as a kid, separate timeline, but I did live there and just have a soft spot. So I really wanted to weave that into the story as well. So that
great little town. It's a great little town.
I love Wilmington. I really do.
It was my stomping grounds when I was in the Marines. I loved that town.
Okay, very good. Yeah. It's I've gone back over the years, and every time I'm just like, I just have this spot. So I really went back to my memories of being in Wilmington in the 70s, like when they built Independence Mall. I remember them clearing the field and building the mall. So like I use that in the story because these are things that I definitely like remembered about kind of like Wilmington growing and becoming the town. I mean, it's even bigger now, but so that story had a lot of like, if I always say I'm never going to write a memoir, but if I was going to, that's probably the closest I'm ever going to get to that.
The home of Michael Jordan.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I don't forget that because it's on the sign as you drive in. It's the home of Michael Jordan, or the Jordans, I guess. The
Jordans, yeah.
But yeah. All right, you ready to tackle our questionnaire?
Sure.
All right. So we're gonna do the questionnaire, invented by the great Bernard Pivot and perfected by the awesome James Lipton in the show Inside the Actors Studio, and now taken by me and ripped apart and transformed yet again. So, Juliet, what is your favorite word to write?
My favorite word to write? Ooh, that's a good one. I actually don't know because I love words so much that like, depending on the book, it might be like vitriolic was a word that I was really enjoying for a while, so I kind of like I'll come across a word, I just want to use that word. So I'll say that word, vitriolic.
Okay. What is your least favorite word to write?
The.
It seems like prepositions are the ones that everybody can. The, was, no.
Just, I say it too much, but I write it too much. But I hate that I write it so much.
So what turns you on, either creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Kindness, compassion, honestly, connection between people. It's really kind of my driving force to existence.
And what turns you off?
The opposite. I think when people are bigots, hatred, I really hate when people kind of blanketly judge other people or a sect of people based on, no knowledge, based on whatever it is within themselves that really just wants to perpetuate hate.
Awesome. So what is here's the favorite one for everybody. What is your favorite curse word?
Ooh, I say shit ass a lot. I do. Probably fuck ass would be second. So yeah.
So it has to have the ass in it somewhere.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I love it. That's a new one. We haven't heard that one yet. All right. What sound or noise do you love?
Oh. I mean, I love music. I'd say I'm not a musician in any way, shape, or form, but it really is such a driving force for me is music.
Nice. You write with music going?
Usually, yeah. And I usually even kind of have like, and I'm sure most writers do, like have almost like a little bit of a playlist to that story. You know, like this song would go great in this scene type of thing. So
what sound or noise do you dislike?
Ooh, so many. I really hate when trucks use like that air brake thing, you know, when they're going past and they hit that. Like, oh, I hate that sound.
Okay, what character of yours would put their face on the currency of their world?
Wow, that's a tough one. Because all of my characters to a degree are a little self-deprecating. So it's really hard because none of them would really feel confident enough to do that.
You don't have a villain that would do that?
Maybe in Dreams We Fly, the aunt's boyfriend, because he thinks very highly of himself.
Okay. What artistry would you love to try that you haven't yet?
That's interesting because it's kind of the two things. I think we talked about screenwriting. It's something I've always wanted to do. And I love music, but I know I'm not good at it. So, probably screenwriting.
So what artistry would you never try?
In public or ever?
Ever. Yeah.
I don't think there's anything I wouldn't try. I like to try things out just to see. I mean, I can quickly say, yeah, I suck at it, but I definitely always like to try things out.
Nice. All right. So if heaven or whatever you believe exists beyond, whatever it is beyond, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive?
Everybody's welcome.
Well, Juliet, you are always welcome here at Go Indie Now. We love having you. It was a real pleasure to get to talk to you for this time period. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this and pick your brain, especially now that I'm reading what you're writing, and it's very awesome. So thank you so much for being here. Tell everybody a little bit tell everybody where they can find you.
Best place to find me is my author website, which is authorjulietrose.com. It has links to my social media. It has my bio, links to my
books,
different things like that. So that's a great jumping off point.
Awesome. Yeah, everybody go check it out. Especially Stitched Together Stitches Together is one of the one I'm reading, and it's fucking fabulous. So awesome. Everybody go check that out, and remember that it's always time to go indie now. We'll see you soon, everybody. Bye.